20th century, the story is usually told this way. America's timber industry stood at the edge of exhaustion. Forests were vast, but access was brutal. Logging crews worked in steep terrain, knee-deep mud, relentless rain, and bitter cold. Human muscle, horses, and oxen pulled massive logs across uneven ground. Productivity was limited by endurance. Injury was common. Output fluctuated with weather and terrain. Then the machine arrived, a 45-ton mechanical system, steel cables, steam power, towering spars, and engineered leverage, entered the forest. It did not tire. It did not slip in mud the way animals did. It could haul logs across ravines and unstable slopes that had previously slowed or stopped production. What once required teams of men and animals could now be coordinated through pulleys, steam engines, and steel lines. The narrative frames this moment as inevitable, as necessary, as progress. In textbooks, industrial documentaries, and museum exhibits dedicated to American logging, the machine is introduced as a solution to a structural problem: rising demand for lumber in expanding cities, railroads, and shipbuilding. The forests of the Pacific Northwest and other regions were difficult to exploit efficiently. Mechanization increased yield per acre. It reduced reliance on animal power. It accelerated transport from stump to rail line. The machine becomes the turning point. It saved the industry from stagnation. It modernized extraction. It allowed timber companies to remain competitive in a rapidly industrializing economy. Steel replaced sinew. Steam replaced breath. The frontier became manageable. The language is consistent across sources. Efficiency, innovation, expansion, resilience. The machine is cast as the hero of an industry under pressure. Workers are still present in the story, but more as operators than as the primary drivers of production. The forest remains wild, but it is now conquerable. The broader implication is rarely questioned. Technological advancement equals industrial survival. Mechanization equals economic stability. Progress equals machine power. This version of history is not dramatic. It does not need to be. It feels self-evident. In a modern industrial society, machines scale output. Industries that fail to mechanize fall behind. The logic appears clean. And yet, if the story were only about efficiency, only about productivity, why does it so consistently frame the machine not just as useful, but as necessary? Not just as helpful, but as salvational? What precisely was being saved and for whom? If the 45-ton logging machine entered the forest as a solution, the historical record does not read like a simple before and after improvement. Production increased. That much is measurable. Timber output rose in regions where cable systems and steam-powered yarders were deployed. Logs moved faster. Steeper slopes became accessible. Seasonal slowdowns were reduced. But the relationship between higher output and better conditions is less straightforward. Early 20th century labor reports from logging camps describe a shift in the nature of risk rather than its disappearance. Horses were replaced by steel cables under tension. Instead of animals bolting, cables snapped. Instead of logs dragged slowly, they were pulled rapidly through brush and debris. Injuries did not vanish. They changed form. Workers operated closer to powerful machinery. Coordination errors became more consequential. A misjudged signal could release tons of timber in motion. The common narrative states that machines reduce the need for brute force. It is less often asked whether they reduced vulnerability. Mechanization centralized control. Steam donkeys and yarders required trained operators, engineers, maintenance crews. Ownership of capital equipment concentrated authority in the hands of company managers. The pace of work was no longer limited by the stamina of men and animals, but by the schedule set by machinery. Once steam pressure was up, downtime became expensive. This altered labor rhythms. Logging had always been dangerous, but mechanized logging intensified synchronization. Workers were required to adapt to the machine's tempo. In practice, this often meant longer shifts during peak operation windows. Productivity gains did not necessarily translate into shorter workdays. Wage records from some logging regions show incremental increases in pay for skilled operators. At the same time, accounts from labor organizers point to ongoing disputes over safety standards and compensation. The machine reduced certain forms of manual strain, yet it did not eliminate precarity. It reshaped it. There is also the question of scale. By making previously inaccessible terrain economically viable, the machine expanded the geographic footprint of extraction. Forest areas that had been bypassed due to difficulty were now logged. From a narrow industrial perspective, this was efficiency. From an ecological perspective, it accelerated depletion. Popular histories often mention deforestation, but briefly, the focus remains on industrial triumph rather than environmental transformation. Mechanization is framed as a response to demand, not as a factor that reshaped the pace and intensity of resource removal. Another tension appears in the claim that the machine saved the industry. Saved it from what? If the industry faced collapse due to labor shortages or falling productivity, mechanization could indeed stabilize output. But in many regions, the crisis was not simply technical. It involved fluctuating markets, overcutting in earlier decades, price volatility, and speculative land ownership patterns. The machine addressed the mechanics of extraction. It did not resolve structural market cycles. And yet, in retrospective accounts, these distinctions blur. Industrial decline is portrayed as a problem of insufficient technological capacity. The solution becomes mechanical innovation. The broader economic context recedes. There is also a cultural dimension. Early 20th century America placed high symbolic value on industrial strength. Steel, steam, and scale signified national vitality. The logging machine fits seamlessly into that imagery. Photographs emphasized its size relative to men. Trade publications described its power in superlatives. Exhibitions displayed mechanical components as markers of modernity. In this framing, the machine does more than increase output. It confirms a narrative about the nation's capacity to master terrain. The forest becomes a stage for technological competence. The phrase "saved the industry" carries moral weight. It implies inevitability and justification. If something is saved, its preservation appears necessary. The alternative, decline, contraction, reorganization, appears undesirable or impractical. But contraction is not always collapse. Industries transform. Markets shift. Production methods change gradually. The language of salvation compresses these possibilities into a single turning point. Small inconsistencies accumulate. Productivity rose, but so did extraction rates. Certain injuries declined, others increased. Skilled positions expanded, but labor disputes persisted. Output stabilized in some regions, yet overcutting accelerated elsewhere. The machine solved immediate operational challenges while amplifying long-term pressures. None of this invalidates its technical significance. The 45-ton system was undeniably effective within its parameters. It allowed timber companies to move logs across terrain previously considered prohibitive. It redefined what was logistically feasible. The question is not whether the machine worked, The question is why the story so often stops at that point. Why does increased efficiency become synonymous with collective benefit? Why does expanded capacity stand in for stability? Why is the machine framed as the singular agent of rescue, while labor structures, market incentives, and environmental consequences remain secondary? These are not accusations. They are observations about emphasis. When the narrative highlights mechanical triumph and compresses surrounding complexities into footnotes, it creates coherence. It offers a clear arc, problem, invention, salvation. Reality appears less linear, and the more closely the details are examined, the more that arc begins to loosen. Once we move beyond the operational details of the 45-ton logging machine, a broader pattern becomes visible. The history of industrial machinery is rarely presented as a contested process. It is framed as a sequence of breakthroughs that steadily liberated human effort from physical limits. The logging machine is folded into that lineage. Popular accounts often describe it as reducing the most grueling aspects of timber work. Men no longer needed to rely solely on horses to drag immense trunks through mud and rock. Steam power multiplied force. Cable systems reached into steep ravines. The implication is clear. Mechanization meant relief. Yet relief for whom and to what degree? Contemporary photographs and company brochures emphasized the spectacle of scale. A towering spar tree. A massive engine. Workers standing beside it, dwarfed. The visual grammar suggested mastery. Steel imposed order on wilderness. Human ingenuity extended its reach, but when diaries, local newspapers, and early labor investigations are read alongside those images, a more uneven picture emerges. Logging did not become safe or calm. It became systematized. Danger was reorganized around tensioned cables, moving loads, and mechanical timing. The machine did not eliminate hazard. It redistributed it within a more integrated system. Academic studies of early 20th century logging camps note that injury rates remained high even after mechanization expanded. In some cases, the complexity of cable operations required new hierarchies of signaling and coordination. Miscommunication carried amplified consequences. When tons of timber were pulled at speed, the margin for error narrowed. In many simplified histories, this transformation is compressed into a single sentence. Mechanization improved efficiency and reduced labor strain. The wording is technically defensible. It is also incomplete. Another distortion concerns the idea of liberation. Industrial machinery is often credited with freeing workers from brute physical exertion. In certain respects, this occurred. Steam engines and cable systems bore loads that human bodies could not sustain indefinitely. However, mechanization also intensified labor discipline. When production depended on synchronized systems, punctuality and obedience to operational sequences became essential. The machine's rhythm set the day's structure. Idle time became measurable loss. Supervisory oversight tightened. Company records from mechanized camps revealed detailed tracking of output per shift. Efficiency became quantifiable. Workers were increasingly evaluated against mechanical benchmarks rather than seasonal or environmental variability. In this sense, mechanization did not simply reduce physical strain, it introduced new forms of pressure. A third distortion lies in how pace is remembered. Popular narratives often imply that mechanization quickly and uniformly transformed the industry. In reality, adoption was uneven. Smaller operations lagged behind due to capital costs. Terrain varied. Markets fluctuated. Some regions retained hybrid systems combining animal power and machinery for decades. Yet retrospective storytelling smooths this variability into a clear turning point. The machine appears, and the industry modernizes. The lag, the resistance, and the economic constraints become secondary details. This smoothing serves pedagogical clarity. It also reinforces a broader narrative of linear industrial progress. There is also a tendency to normalize environmental consequences as inevitable side effects. Large-scale cable logging accelerated timber removal from steep slopes. This expanded the area of economically viable harvest. The result was not merely higher productivity, but intensified extraction rates. Early conservation debates in the United States reflected growing concern over depletion and watershed damage. These discussions were often framed as policy issues rather than mechanical ones. The machine was portrayed as neutral, a tool responding to demand. Responsibility was assigned to management decisions or regulatory absence. This separation between tool and outcome simplifies causality. It suggests that machines are passive instruments, while social actors alone determine consequences. Yet machines embody economic incentives. When technology lowers the cost of accessing difficult terrain, it alters decision thresholds. Areas once left untouched become profitable. Extraction accelerates not because of malice, but because capability expands. By presenting the machine as neutral and inevitable, the narrative avoids examining how technological capacity reshapes priorities. Comparing popular accounts with scholarly research reveals recurring omissions. Trade magazines from the period celebrated engineering ingenuity. They described horsepower ratings, cable lengths, fuel consumption, and output gains. Their language emphasized competitiveness and modernization. Academic histories, by contrast, situate mechanization within broader systems, capital investment patterns, labor relations, land speculation, and federal land policy. They note how mechanization aligned with corporate consolidation in certain regions. Larger firms could afford expensive equipment. Smaller operators were pressured to scale or exit. These structural dimensions are rarely foregrounded in general histories. Instead, the focus remains on invention and impact at the operational level. There is also the matter of memory. Museums dedicated to logging heritage often display restored steam donkeys and yarders as icons of ingenuity. Interpretive plaques emphasize craftsmanship and industrial courage. The machines are detached from the volatility of timber markets and the ecological transformations that followed mass harvesting. This is not deception, it is curation. A museum cannot display every labor dispute or watershed study alongside each artifact. Narrative economy demands selection, but selection shapes emphasis. When mechanical innovation is consistently centered, while labor conflict and environmental strain appear as context rather than core, the hierarchy of importance becomes implicit. The logging machine thus becomes emblematic of a wider pattern in industrial history. Amplification of technical achievement, compression of social complexity. Even academic writing is not immune to this simplification. Scholars must define scope. A technical history will prioritize engineering development. A labor history will prioritize working conditions. Fragmentation across disciplines can unintentionally reinforce compartmentalized narratives. Readers encounter partial truths depending on the lens. The effect is cumulative. Over time, the machine is remembered primarily as a savior of productivity, of industry, of national growth. The word saved implies a single trajectory narrowly avoided. It reduces alternatives to collapse. But industrial transformation rarely hinges on a single device. It involves regulatory frameworks, transportation infrastructure, market demand, financial credit systems, and shifting labor arrangements. The 45-ton machine operated within that web. It did not stand outside it. The simplification is understandable. Clear arcs are easier to teach. Linear progress is easier to narrate. Machines offer tangible anchors for abstract change. They can be photographed, restored, exhibited. Labor structures and market incentives are less visible. Yet when the visible artifact is elevated as the primary agent of rescue, it risks obscuring the interplay that made its adoption possible and profitable. The machine becomes protagonist. Systems recede into backdrop. The result is not a false history. It is a streamlined one. And the more streamlined the story becomes, the more it invites a careful reconsideration of what has been trimmed away. If the streamlined narrative of the 45-ton logging machine is not accidental, it is worth examining why it remained so stable. The early 20th century was not only an era of industrial expansion, it was also a period in which modern states increasingly tied legitimacy to visible economic growth. Infrastructure, factories, railroads, and extraction industries became markers of national strength. Timber was not simply a commodity. It was material for cities, ships, mines, and rail ties. It was foundational to expansion. In that context, a machine capable of unlocking difficult forests carried symbolic value beyond its engineering function. Mechanization signaled modernity. A state that could extract resources efficiently from rugged terrain appeared capable of governing space. Forests were reframed from obstacles to assets. The transformation of wilderness into productive territory reinforced narratives of progress, order, and capability. This symbolic alignment did not require conspiracy. It required compatibility. Governments sought economic stability, tax revenue, and infrastructural growth. Timber companies sought output and profit. Engineers sought demonstration of technical competence. The machine sat at the intersection of these interests. Public exhibitions, industrial fairs, and trade publications amplified this alignment. Large logging machinery was displayed as evidence of national vigor. The emphasis was not only on output figures, but on scale and control. The machine represented the capacity to overcome geographic limits. By associating technology with civilization, the narrative became politically convenient. If mechanization equaled advancement, then policies facilitating industrial expansion appeared forward-looking. Federal land policies, railroad incentives, and access to capital could be framed as enabling progress rather than accelerating depletion. The machine's success became proof that modernization strategies were justified. This framing also reduced social friction. Industrialization generates conflict. Labor disputes, displacement, environmental damage. When machinery is cast as neutral progress, opposition risks appearing anti-modern. Critics can be portrayed as resisting inevitability rather than questioning distribution of benefits. The 45-ton machine thus functioned symbolically as well as materially. It condensed abstract economic objectives into a visible artifact. Steel and steam were easier to defend than fluctuating wage structures or speculative land deals. There is also the stabilizing effect of narrative continuity. Modern states depend on coherent origin stories. Industrial triumphs offer foundational myths of competence. The logging machine fits neatly into a broader American narrative of conquering frontiers through ingenuity. This narrative integrates well with education systems that prioritize national development arcs. A complex account, one that foregrounds market volatility, ecological acceleration, and uneven labor impacts, complicates that arc. It introduces ambiguity into what is otherwise a story of technological rescue. Ambiguity is harder to institutionalize. It does not translate as easily into textbooks or public monuments. It requires sustained attention to trade-offs and structural constraints. It resists clear heroes. By contrast, a machine can embody progress without inviting prolonged controversy. It can be admired without assigning blame. This convenience extends to corporate memory. Companies benefit from histories that emphasize innovation and resilience. Celebrating mechanical breakthroughs reinforces brand identity and managerial foresight. A narrative centered on technological salvation highlights competence. A narrative centered on labor conflict or environmental exhaustion highlights tension. Neither is fabricated, but emphasis signals value. The alignment between state modernization goals and corporate industrial narratives created a mutually reinforcing story. Mechanization saved productivity. Productivity sustained growth. Growth validated governance and investment strategies. Over time, repetition solidified the framing. Even later, conservation efforts were sometimes narrated within the same logic. Sustainable forestry practices were presented as advanced management techniques enabled by scientific and technological expertise. The machine, once again, symbolized rational control, this time over depletion rather than terrain. The deeper pattern is subtle. Technological artifacts become shorthand for systemic achievements. They offer clarity in complex histories. They stabilize collective memory by providing focal points. This does not require deliberate distortion. It emerges from institutional incentives. Educational curricula favor coherent arcs. Museums favor tangible objects. Political rhetoric favors visible accomplishments. Corporate histories favor demonstrable breakthroughs. The 45-ton logging machine satisfied all these criteria. It was large, visible, photogenic, and undeniably effective at increasing output in difficult landscapes. It allowed multiple actors, state officials, engineers, executives, to point to a concrete symbol of progress. The costs were diffuse. Environmental acceleration unfolded over decades. Labor disputes occurred in specific camps and regions. Market volatility fluctuated with global demand. These phenomena lacked the singular presence of a steel structure towering in the forest. Convenience and stability reinforce one another. A simplified narrative reduces social tension. It affirms continuity. It presents industrialization as adaptive and forward-moving rather than contested and contingent. Yet stability can mask fragility. When an industry is said to have been saved by a machine, the statement implies that technological capacity is sufficient to secure long-term viability. It sidelines the possibility that structural pressures, resource limits, economic cycles, regulatory shifts remain unresolved. The political usefulness of the machine story lies in its reassurance. It suggests that ingenuity can overcome constraint, that scale can substitute for scarcity, that engineering can compensate for volatility. Such reassurance is not entirely misplaced. Machines do expand capability, but capability is not the same as equilibrium. The logging machine did not operate in isolation. It functioned within policies, incentives, and expectations that favored expansion. The narrative that elevates it as savior reinforces those same orientations. By presenting mechanization as both necessary and triumphant, the story becomes self-stabilizing. It validates the frameworks that made mechanization attractive in the first place. And in doing so, it reduces the need to examine whether alternative trajectories, slower extraction, different ownership models, modified labor structures, were ever meaningfully considered. The convenience of the narrative is precisely what makes it durable. Outside the main arc of industrial triumph, there exists a different layer of documentation. It is less frequently cited in popular summaries of the 45-ton logging machine. It does not contradict its technical effectiveness, but it complicates the meaning of its impact. Early 20th century labor reports from logging regions in the Pacific Northwest describe camps where mechanization coexisted with persistent instability. Investigations into workplace safety noted that cable systems introduced new forms of injury. High-tension lines, when mismanaged or worn, could recoil with lethal force. Logs moved at greater speeds across unpredictable terrain. Accident logs recorded crushed limbs, falls from spars, and fatalities linked to mechanical operations rather than animal mishaps. These reports did not frame machinery as villainous. They documented operational realities. Yet they revealed that reduced labor strain did not equate to reduced vulnerability. Technical manuals from equipment manufacturers provide another perspective. Detailed instructions outlined maintenance intervals, lubrication schedules, pressure tolerances, and cable replacement protocols. Implicit in these instructions was acknowledgement of system fragility. Steam systems required constant attention. Failures could cascade quickly. Productivity gains depended on disciplined upkeep and skilled oversight. When read alongside promotional literature celebrating output records, these manuals suggest that efficiency was conditional. The machine's power relied on organized labor, stable fuel supply, and disciplined routines. Company correspondence preserved in regional archives adds further nuance. Managers discussed capital costs, depreciation, and competition. Purchasing a 45-ton yarder represented a substantial investment. Smaller operators sometimes entered debt to mechanize. Letters reveal concern about recouping costs during downturns in lumber prices. In this context, mechanization was not only a technical upgrade, but a financial gamble. Firms that could not maintain high throughput risked insolvency. The machine raised both potential output and fixed obligations. Environmental surveys from the same period document accelerated clearing of steep slope forests following the introduction of cable systems. Hydrological studies conducted by early conservationists observed increased erosion in certain watersheds after intensive logging. These studies did not always attribute change directly to specific machines. Yet they recorded the broader consequence of expanded reach. Such documents rarely appear in condensed accounts of industrial salvation. They reside in forestry journals, academic monographs, and regulatory debates. There are also union records and organizing pamphlets that reflect worker responses to mechanization. Some skilled operators leveraged their expertise to demand higher wages. Others protested unsafe conditions. Strikes in logging regions often centered on pay, hours, and camp standards rather than on machinery itself. The machine was part of the environment within which these disputes unfolded. This distinction matters. Workers did not uniformly reject mechanization. Many relied on it for employment. At the same time, they negotiated its implications. Their demands suggest that the machine altered bargaining dynamics. Skill differentiation increased. Certain roles became more specialized. Others became more interchangeable. Academic industrial histories published decades later analyze these shifts with measured language. They trace how mechanization aligned with corporate consolidation and regional market integration. Larger firms could standardize operations across multiple sites. Smaller camps faced competitive pressure. In these studies, the 45-ton machine is rarely framed as a singular savior. It appears as one node in a network of capital flows, transportation infrastructure, and regulatory evolution. The divergence between this scholarship and popular memory is subtle. It is not a clash of facts, but of emphasis. Popular narratives foreground spectacle and breakthrough. Archival materials foreground procedure and consequence. One forestry bulletin from the early 20th century warned that sustained yield practices would require moderation of cutting rates despite improved mechanical capacity. The document acknowledged that new technology made rapid harvests possible. It also cautioned that ecological regeneration operated on different timescales. This tension between mechanical speed and biological renewal sits largely outside simplified industrial arcs. Even trade journals occasionally revealed anxiety. Editorials praised innovation, but noted volatility in lumber markets. Overproduction could depress prices. Mechanization amplified supply responsiveness, which in turn intensified cyclical swings. These sources do not dismantle the claim that the logging machine expanded capacity. They show that expansion interacted with ecological and economic constraints. The cumulative effect of these lesser-cited documents is not to overturn the central narrative but to thicken it. They indicate that mechanization reshaped risk, labor relations, financial exposure, and environmental pace. They demonstrate that the machine's story cannot be isolated from broader structural dynamics. Yet such complexity rarely anchors public memory. A single machine can be photographed, restored, and displayed. A strike ledger, a watershed survey, or a depreciation schedule lacks comparable symbolic clarity. As a result, the supporting documents remain peripheral. They are accessible, but not central. Their existence suggests that the story of salvation through machinery was always accompanied by quieter records. Records of adaptation, negotiation, strain, and recalibration. When those records are placed alongside the image of the towering 45-ton system, the contrast becomes visible. The machine was powerful. It was also embedded. If the story of the 45-ton logging machine is neither false nor complete, then what remains unsettled? The machine clearly expanded what was technically possible. It allowed timber companies to extract wood from terrain that had previously limited output. It reorganized labor around synchronized systems. It increased throughput in regions where demand was rising. None of these outcomes are in dispute. What becomes less stable, however, is the assumption that technological expansion alone constitutes salvation. When the machine is described as having saved the timber industry, the statement carries embedded assumptions that higher productivity ensured long-term stability, that mechanization resolved structural vulnerability, that expanded reach was inherently corrective rather than accelerative. But industries rarely hinge on a single device. They depend on market cycles, resource availability, transportation networks, capital access, regulatory frameworks, and labor structures. The logging machine operated within those constraints. It amplified capacity. It did not erase contingency. The historical narrative that elevates it to a moment of rescue simplifies this interdependence. It transforms a complex adjustment into a turning point. This simplification is understandable. It provides coherence. It offers a tangible symbol of adaptation. It aligns with a broader cultural pattern that associates scale and steel with resilience. Yet once the surrounding documentation is considered, labor reports, environmental surveys, financial correspondence, uneven adoption patterns, the clarity of the rescue narrative softens. Productivity increased, but so did extraction rates. Skilled roles expanded, but labor tensions persisted. Access to difficult forests improved, but ecological strain intensified. Capital investment enabled growth, but also deepened exposure to market volatility. These dynamics do not negate the machine's importance. They reposition it. Instead of appearing as the decisive agent that secured the industry's survival, the machine can be seen as one mechanism through which existing incentives were extended. It responded to demand, and in responding, it reshaped thresholds: economic, environmental, organizational. The assumption that technology equals stabilization begins to look less certain. There is also the question of narrative inheritance. When present-day discussions about automation and mechanization draw on past examples, they often invoke stories of technological rescue. Industries modernize, productivity rises, growth resumes. The precedent appears reassuring, but if the earlier story was already streamlined, if it compressed structural complexity into mechanical triumph, then the reassurance rests on partial framing. The 45-ton logging machine did not simply conquer terrain. It operated within a system that favored expansion as a measure of success. Its adoption made sense within that system. Its memory reinforces it. What remains unclear is whether alternative trajectories were structurally viable or merely unchosen. Could slower extraction models have sustained the industry differently? Could labor structures have evolved without intensifying discipline? Could environmental pacing have been integrated into industrial planning more centrally? These questions do not produce definitive answers. The historical record does not offer a parallel timeline for comparison. What it does reveal is that the assumption of inevitability is fragile. Mechanization occurred within specific economic and political contexts. It aligned with prevailing priorities. It solved immediate operational constraints. It also carried consequences that unfolded over decades. To recognize this is not to diminish engineering achievement, it is to resituate it. The logging machine was powerful. It was not autonomous. Its story was shaped by the needs and interests of the era that embraced it. The narrative that frames it as savior reflects those same priorities. If we loosen the certainty of that framing, the question shifts, not whether the machine worked, but whether the way we remember it has worked to stabilize a particular understanding of industrial progress. And if that understanding feels self-evident, what assumptions are quietly sustaining it?